So, news from the federal justice system. So, in the last day or so, there's been some rather interesting headlines coming out of Washington, D.C. concerning events within the justice system, within the courts, within the Attorney General's office. And so we're going to be looking at those headlines and processing what some of them may mean. So first, let's talk about the injury. Manny, last class, you talked about hearing about a woman who broke 3 ribs. Well, found out exactly which woman in government it was. It was actually Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She broke 3 ribs in a fall last Wednesday. The 85-year-old Supreme Court Justice happened to have an accidental fall where she broke 3 ribs. Now, the dangers of rib injuries in older patients are actually kind of extreme. At a woman of her age, many times there's a fear of lung collapse, that when the ribs break, they will puncture or otherwise press in on the lungs, leading to collapsed lung. Even if the lung doesn't collapse, since the ribs can't be held in place, they can't be set the way an arm could or a finger could. Anytime an individual breathes deeply with a broken rib, it's going to cause pain. This often leads individuals to not breathe in as fully as they normally would, which can increase the likelihood of lung-based infections such as pneumonia. So what are the political ramifications of Justice Ginsburg's fall? At the moment, none. She's fine, she went to the hospital, but there's no sign of this potentially ending her judiciary career. However, in the event that Justice Ginsburg were to have died or retired, if this were to happen now or within the next 2 years, President Trump would appoint her successor. It's a bit of a dangerous position. She is a more Democratic-leaning justice, a more left-wing justice. If Donald Trump were able to appoint another justice, it would be a more right-wing-leaning justice. Now, speaking of people that Donald Trump appointed, let's talk about the resignation of Attorney General Jeff Sessions. So, Jeff Sessions resigned last Wednesday at the request of White House staff. A head of Trump's cabinet in the White House basically came forward and stated a message saying to Sessions that the president wanted him to resign, and Sessions decided to do it. Now, the request came after months of Trump criticizing Sessions. So why? Trump appointed this guy, so why precisely is he so mad at Jeff Sessions? Well, what it has to do with criticism over Sessions' decision to recuse himself from the Mueller investigation. Remember, Robert Mueller is the special prosecutor heading an investigation into charges of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia back during the 2016 election. So when the accusation came out that their campaign was potentially colluding with the Russian government, a special investigation was launched. Now, because Jeff Sessions was politically close to Trump, he agreed to recuse himself. So he said, basically, for all intents and purposes, I'm not going to be involved in the investigation. I'm not heading it. They don't answer to me. I'm taking my hands off because I know I have a political bias. That's a big thing. It's actually one of the more honorable things that can be said about Jeff Sessions. A lot of people disagree on his policies on immigration enforcement, things of that nature. But one thing that can definitely be said, at the very least, there was a certain degree of professionalism and honor in recusing himself from an investigation that, for political reasons, he would likely have wanted to see never happen. So what are the political ramifications of this man over here, Jeff Sessions, being replaced by this man over here? So, until such time as Trump can get the Senate to approve a new Attorney General, Matthew Whitaker will be acting as the Attorney General, and he has been extremely critical of the Mueller investigation, going as far as to recommend that the president has the power to shut it down, and wishing that those within the Attorney General's office would simply cut down the funding on the investigation until it could no longer function. So his desire to limit or simply end the investigation is rather interesting, as he has not recused himself. So it's entirely possible that he, as the new head of that, of the Department of Justice, he could now seek, as the acting Attorney General, basically, to enforce that will, to now try and shut down the investigation. Now, it's not all the time I get to talk to you about a Supreme Court case that is in the process of occurring. And it's even rarer when I get to do it with a justice where we had a debate about the ethics of that person being the judge. So I give you the newest case coming out of the Supreme Court, Bucklew versus Precythe. I think that's how you pronounce that last one. I'm not sure. So what's going on? So the case revolves around a convicted murderer and rapist named Russell Bucklew, who about 22 years ago shot a man in cold blood, abducted and raped his ex-girlfriend, and shot at the child of that ex-girlfriend. He later broke out of jail and tried to assault the woman's mother with a hammer. He also injured a police officer during a gunfight that ensued during the initial rape and murder incident. Now, Bucklew was convicted of these crimes and was sentenced to death by courts in Missouri. And he's not contesting that. He's not trying to get out of the death penalty per se. He's not challenging his conviction, nor is he challenging his sentence. Instead, what he's challenging is the fact that he has a rare medical condition where tumors form inside the blood, and these tumors could burst. And if they burst during the execution process, he could die choking on his own blood, which his attorneys argue is a violation of the Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishments. So, what's a fellow to do? He is recommending that he be executed instead by poisonous gas, a method that, while the state of Missouri allows for gas chamber-based executions, one has not been carried out in recent decades. There's not really any mechanism in place to have it done. Now, what's particularly interesting is that Kavanaugh, who you all remember our debates about whether or not Kavanaugh should be a Supreme Court judge. Kavanaugh is currently questioning the Missouri Solicitor General, and he's critical of Missouri's position on wanting to execute Bucklew regardless of any pain it might cause Bucklew. Because Missouri just wants to execute him by lethal injection, like they do all individuals who are sentenced to death in Missouri. So, big question that for me comes up first is, why is Kavanaugh acting like this? So there's two different theories going around. So one is that it's an attempt to appear nonpartisan. In other words, he's a more right-wing leaning justice. He's a more conservative justice. But Supreme Court justices are supposed to be nonpartisan. So because of the fact that he was very much the darling of the right wing, of the more conservative factions of Congress when he was appointed, and liberals disdained him, they thought he was the scum of the earth and he should never have been made judge, this might be an attempt to appear a little more moderate. So he's going to kind of play the part of a more liberal individual, trying to be more compassionate. I care even about the criminal person who's been convicted. He still has rights to at least not suffer a cruel or unusual death, etc. Is that what's going on? Try to get a cuddlier Kavanaugh. Or, as many have cynically suggested, it is rather interesting. You have a gentleman who's been, and I use the word gentleman extremely loosely, in references to Justice Kavanaugh, who's been accused of rape, multiple accounts of rape, and is on the Supreme Court, and he's looking for mercy for a convicted rapist. Is that a coincidence, or is it sort of a birds of a feather flock together type of a deal? I don't know. Very curious to see what your thoughts are on this one. Now, another question I'm curious to all you guys to think about is, how would you decide this case? Suppose you were on the Supreme Court and had to make a decision like this. What would you recommend be done with Buckler? Should they kill him by lethal injection? Should they give him the gas chamber sentence like he wants? Should they do something else? Hanging, firing squad, electric chair? Those have all been legal within the U.S. And then there's always some fun stuff internationally. Guillotines and whatnot. The French used that one up until the 1970s. So it's really up. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this process. What do you think should be done? Maybe you don't think he should be executed. He should just stay in prison for the rest of his life. That's a more fitting punishment. So take a few moments to think that out. What would you do in this case? The Supreme Court still hasn't decided yet. So I'm curious what you guys would do.